So welcome to today's webinar. We will start, this is the first Soil Values webinar, and today is also World Food Day, and some may link healthy soils to healthy food. A couple of words about Soil Values. Soil Values is a 4-year horizon project that started in February 2023. Aiming to improve soil health through value-based business models. We are thrilled to see so many of you joined us to exchange on the findings of our first discussion paper entitled Incentivizing the Transition to Soil Health, Regenerative Farming Practices, Leveraging Blended Finance for Effective Incentives Design. My name is Caroline Maar. I work at the European Landowners Organization as EU Project and Policy Officer, leading Work Package 5 on communication and dissemination in the Soil Values Consortium. With the help of my colleague Sergio, I will moderate today's webinar, organized around the presentations of Marc Rosier, Managing Director of MR-FNA Consult, Silvana Limni, Junior Analyst at Cois Invest, and Matteo Vanzini, Associate at Cois Invest. Today's agenda is as follows. We will start this webinar with a general introduction to the soil health situation in the EU and the project Soil Values as such, followed by a 30-minute explanation on the methodology used by the Cois Invest colleagues and present the key findings of the discussion paper. We will then have 30 minutes to questions and answers. So questions that you, dear participants, will send us through the chat box. In terms of housekeeping, we inform you that this webinar will be recorded and published online on YouTube and on Soil Values. If possible, please indicate to whom the question goes when writing it in the chat box. I will address the questions to the relevant panelists by reading it out loud. And at the end of the webinar, we would kindly ask you to fill in a very short survey that will pop up on your screen when you will unlog from this webinar. I would like now to introduce today's first speaker, Marc Rosier. So Marc Rosier holds a Master's of Science in Economics from the KU Leuven and London School of Economics. He can look back on 25 years of experience as internal consultant and board member in agri-food companies, agri-food investors, and professional associations. Since 2016, he is managing director of MR-FNA Consult. Marc is also one of the 14 partners of Soil Values, and will now introduce the project's relevance and objectives. So Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Within the Soil Values project, I'm in the support of the Soil Values project coordinator, Professor Erik Matthijs from KU Leuven, together with Katova Remberg. Let's set first the scene. Agriculture in the European Union faces significant challenges in reducing its environmental impact and adapting to new climate realities. That's really an open door. A striking 60% of EU soils are degraded, highlighting an urgent need for action. This soil degradation not only affects food production, but also contributes to broader environmental issues. Beyond CO2 emissions, the focus must expand to include a broader range of factors such as soil fertility, soil biodiversity, soil water management, to name a few, all impacting soil quality and sustainability. Moreover, as you can see on the slide, agriculture is responsible for 11% of total greenhouse gas emissions within the EU. This shows the sector's substantial contribution to climate change, with methane and nitrous oxide emissions from livestock and soil management as key sources. Reducing these emissions is crucial to meeting the EU's climate goals. One of the main policy objectives of the EU is to achieve climate neutrality by 2035, and reaching these targets will require significant changes in agricultural practices, emphasizing emphasizing sustainable approaches that ensure both ecological and economic resilience in the sector. Please, next slide. The EU agriculture and the economic pressure on farmers is huge, a barrier to and it's also a barrier to soil health investments. Because while farmers in the EU are increasingly aware of the need for sustainable practices, including investments in healthier soils, they face significant economic constraints that limit their ability to take action. So despite a steady increase in farm income over the past few years, the viability of farming is being challenged by rising production costs, which erode profitability. The expenses related to labor, energy, and other inputs have all escalated, putting huge pressure on the margin of farming businesses. You can see it in the graph. It highlights how public support plays a crucial role in maintaining farm income. As production costs rise, farmers rely heavily on subsidies and other forms of public assistance to stay afloat. This support has become an essential component of farm revenues, without which the financial stability of many farms would be jeopardized. So as economic conditions remain challenging, there is a need for policies that not only address these immediate financial concerns, but also provide long-term incentives for investment in sustainable practices, such as improving soil health. Ensuring that farmers have the means to invest in healthier soils is therefore critical for the sustainability of agriculture and for the meeting broader environmental goals. Like Caroline said, the SoilValues project is a 4-year project under the Horizon Europe program, with the aim to improve soil health through innovative, value-based business models. We are not alone working on that. We have 2 sister projects, Invest Soil and Soil, and together, we are part of a broader Horizon Mission Soil framework, aiming to combat soil degradation by developing sustainable, economically viable solutions that benefit both the environment and farming communities. We are running from January 23 to December 26, and this project seeks to enhance the conditions for developing successful soil health business models by first incorporating the measurement of soil-based ecosystem services. Secondly, exchanging this obtained information to facilitate monitoring, reporting, and verification. And finally, to incorporate appropriate institutional frameworks such as legislations, standards, and incentive schemes for proper governance. Bringing together a consortium of leading research institutes, universities, and organizations, SoilValues represent a real collaborative effort across Europe. So, like I said, we explore the conditions for developing successful soil health business models through 5 key work streams. The first one is to provide a comprehensive assessment framework, addressing all factors influencing the development of business models for investing in soil health. This work package is run by Wageningen University. The second one is to establish 6 testing grounds across Europe to test and improve emerging and designing new soil health business models, which is run by ILVO. The third objective is to establish 12 communities of practice of land managers, value chain actors, investors, and public authorities for soil health business model, which is run by Consoli. The fourth one is to design a comprehensive toolbox of incentive and policy recommendations to facilitate soil health business model, which is run by Kois Invest. And finally, we have, of course, to raise awareness and exchange knowledge for soil health business model by a far developed dissemination, exploitation, and communication strategy, which is put in place by European Landowners Organization. Of course, this whole set of objective is controlled and run by Workpack 6, like we call it, and that's the global coordination of the project headed by Kyle. So to sum up, the main objective is to promote and prioritize soil health at all levels of agri-food chain by developing successful integrated soil health business models targeting land managers, value chain actors, policy makers, intermediaries, scientists, and other actors active in the agri-food value chain. I give the floor back to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm trying to shy away from the sun. Before giving the word to Matteo, I would like to introduce Coris. Matteo, I will introduce you. Matteo holds a master's in poverty, inequality, and development from the University of Birmingham. He's had previous experience in sustainable projects within the nonprofit sector, along with experience working on financial innovation for socio-economic development. And Matteo joined COIS in 2023, so just on time for the SoilValues project's kickoff. Matteo, the floor is yours to introduce COIS.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, so piggyback on what Mark just mentioned, outlining the different work packages at COIS. Indeed, we are in charge of work package 4 on incentives, but our framework and really kind of our industry and sector, if you like, is impact finance. We are an impact finance organization. These 2 words are key to everything we do. We have a global footprint in the map. Maybe you don't see it too clear, but in green is where our offices are. We have offices across Europe, India, and 1 in Nairobi, Kenya. But our projects really span different geography, in particular in emerging markets, where the need for innovative financial instruments to tackle the sustainable development goals it's huge. We have experience of working across different financial products and solutions within the framework of innovative finance. So first, impact bonds. COIS was the first organization to launch an impact bonds in continental Europe after the first experience in the UK. For the ones who are not familiar, impact bonds is effectively one of the instruments within the results-based finance. So where the upfront capital and investment in form of debt is repaid with outcome funds, meaning payments that are attached to the achievement of tangible and measurable outcomes. We do a huge amount also in blended finance, and we'll come to that later on in the presentation, as it's kind of linked to the point we're trying to make around soil health. We work with different clients from philanthropic sector, NGO, corporates, investors, developing instruments that really blend different capital and different capital provider and risk return appetite. A key point of blended finance is really about using that philanthropic and public capital to catalyze and mobilize commercial and private ones. And we have done that across different area sectors and products as well. And then lastly, one other kind of core side of our business is asset management, more from a kind of impact investing perspective, with funds that we both set up internally or we have launched with in partnership with our clients. In particular, one, a private equity fund based in Europe called Impact Expansion is recently closed 150 million and is looking at investment in the European Union as well. At COIS, we work across 3 verticals of impact areas: healthcare, with huge experience, in particular also in our kind of direct investment in India, then education and skilling and everything that is about also youth empowerment, and then climate and nature. And it's within this context of climate and nature that our link with soil health and agriculture comes to play. Next slide, please. The way we framed our conversation around soil health business model that we heard from Mark being the focus soil value is this concept of regenerative agriculture that is increasingly interesting to a wide range of stakeholders, included COIs. And there are three main reasons that I wanted to highlight today to frame our conversation, so you will understand why we went into this direction. And the three interesting points about regenerative agriculture is, first, its intrinsic interest into soil health outcomes rather than prescribed solution. The definition of regenerative agriculture is still loose, but it doesn't provide a list of things you need to do, but it's rather about what you would like to achieve. And that's very much aligned to the concept of results-based finance, for example, that I've shown you before we work with at COIS. Secondly, and probably also similar to the reason why COIS is into this business of regenerative agriculture, is that as a term, as a practice, as a framework, it speaks to different ears, different stakeholders, attract different actors across the value chain. We've been talking to farmers that define themselves as regenerative. Within the agri-food value chain, corporates are increasingly using these terms. Within science, the debate is on different stakeholders from different areas are looking increasingly at this as a potential framework for soil health. And then last, but by no means least for importance, what's really attractive about regenerative agriculture is strong business and investment case proposition. The idea that, yes, we're looking for something that improves soil health, but we're also looking for something that could really support the viability. One of the key issues is how can farming be viable? And regenerative agriculture offered that proposition really by presenting a possible shift from a model that is only focused on the outputs and on the revenue and how much your yield, how big it is, to a model that offer profitable and sustainable business models. And because of this frame, our research and the conversation we'll be having later on will be linked to regenerative agriculture. So back to you, Kara.
Thank you, Matteo. Very clear introduction. And to be sure that you all really understood what Soil Values is about, we are going to play now our 1-minute introduction video. So Sergio, it's your turn.
Soil, a precious resource for agriculture, food production, and society. Healthy soils act against climate change, absorbing carbon and reducing flood risks. But here's the fact: 70% of soils in the EU are unhealthy. The challenge? To incentivize investment in soil health through viable business models. This is why Europe is taking steps with initiatives like SoilValues. A first approach aims to offer land managers rewards programs, such as payments for ecosystem services, through government subsidies and private incentives. Yet, these innovative business models require appropriate institutional frameworks and a robust MRV scheme, tracking how well we're doing in protecting and enhancing our soils. SoilValues aims to explore and test all these approaches, with 14 partners across 9 member states. Their focus is on research and innovation, with 7 testing grounds across Europe. And there's more. SoilValues is contributing to design a comprehensive toolbox of incentives and policy recommendations. Collaboration between land managers and other stakeholders within the agri-food industry is also essential for developing value-based business models. This is why the project is now establishing 12 communities of practices holding the discussion and developing avenues to scale up soil health business models. To secure a viable future for all, restoring our soil is urgent. Learn more about SoilValues.
Thank you, Sergio. And now I would like to invite Silvana to present the research COIS conducted. As a quick reminder, feel free to send us questions during the presentations that you will listen to. I will then do my utmost best to read them out and allocate them to the respective panelists.
Soil.
Before I give the floor to Silvana, I briefly introduce her. Silvana holds a master's degrees in international development from Sciences Po Paris and a bachelor in international relations from Queen Mary University of London. Silvana brings over 2 years of experience in international development and impact evaluations. Silvana joined COIS in July 2023. And Silvana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolina. So within SoilValues, COIS was tasked to identify and assess the effectiveness of incentives that are available to farmers in Europe, promoting the adoption of regenerative soil health farming practices. During our research, we mapped and categorized 29 types of incentives, and after an extensive outreach, we conducted 54 interviews with relevant stakeholders from the public and private sector. Next slide, please. We identified a wide range of actors involved in the transition, including agri-food and textile corporates, commercial banks with a large portfolio of farmers, impact investors, and project intermediaries and carbon players, among others. What we observed is that the key common drivers and motivation to engage in the transition were to achieve climate and nature targets, such as emission reduction and net zero targets, to de-risk their business models and make their supply chains future-proof, for example, by securing the future availability of raw materials, and to position themselves in the market, capitalizing on new opportunities that are emerging in the voluntary carbon markets and other payments for ecosystem services, and also to position their brand in a new space, given the increasing prominence of regenerative agriculture. Next slide, please. All these actors need to address the barriers that farmers are currently facing when transitioning to a new farming system. These barriers can be psychological, linked to social and cultural norms that lead to risk aversion and resistance to innovation. They can be linked to a lack of specialized technical knowledge on how to implement the practices on their fields. They can be related to uncertain market conditions and a mismatch between demand and supply, or financial, due to challenges in accessing additional financing to cover the costs of transitioning. Next slide, please. From the stakeholders that we analyzed and talked to, these are the instruments that we came across that are encouraging farmers to protect and enhance soil health. Next slide, please. What we found useful was to categorize them based on the type of support they are providing farmers, which is financial, so incentives that provide direct income support, such as price premiums, subsidies, and revenues made through carbon finance. It is de-risking support, which reduces and redistributes the risk to other actors in the supply chain who are equipped to bear it. For example, insurance, compensation loss, or long-term offtake agreements, and technical support, which encompass both agronomic and business management advice. Next slide, please. As a next step, we assess the effectiveness of these instruments by developing this three-tiered framework. We consider an effective incentive when it is adopted by farmers, so whether farmers are aware of it and they show appetite, when it improves soil health, and in this regard, we did not investigate the effect of the practices on soil itself, but rather we used as a proxy whether the impact was being measured and verified, and also whether it proves economically advantageous to farmers, so whether it made business sense for them to adopt it. Next slide, please. So the key finding of our assessment was that no individual instrument or stakeholder can single-handedly incentivize the transition. While some can drive adoption, they're not impactful on an environmental or economic level, or vice versa. In terms of adoption, the key challenges we identified were the limited scale of programs and initiatives, which often remain at a pilot stage, the burdensome bureaucratic procedure, which are limiting farmers' engagement. On an environmental impact level, a limiting factor was, for example, the absence of a unified framework to measure the impact of regenerative agriculture. And finally, they fail to provide often a cost-effective and economically viable proposition for the farmers. Next slide, please. So indeed, as we've seen before, in order to effectively drive the transition, farmers need a comprehensive package of incentives that provide all three types of support: financing, de-risking, and technical assistance, which therefore facilitate access to new revenue streams and unlock cost savings. So de-risking so that they mitigate the uncertainties, and technical so that they equip the farmers with the necessary tools and knowledge. Next slide, please. So please drop in the chat any questions you may have regarding our key findings of the research before we move on to the recommendations for effective incentive design. So I can see in the chat a question regarding a question from Katarzyna. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but forgive me. So for incentives, regenerative agriculture improves soil health, but there is a higher tax that farmers need to pay for higher quality of soil. So there is a fiscal disincentive. How to overcome this? So in this research, for the purpose of our task, we decided to focus on positive incentives. What the supply of incentives in this case can do to encourage the farmers to adopt these practices. And we did not look at the negative disincentives in terms of tax from a more policy level.
Thank you, Silvana. I don't know if Mark, you're able to say anything about the fiscal incentives. Is this something where you could react, perhaps?
I was not aware about the taxes that farmers have to pay on the higher quality of soil. It's a little bit counterproductive, if I might say, because yeah, a farmer that rents out land, I do not see how. But okay, perhaps this is a specific case in Poland. I'm not sure if it's a specific case in Poland. In the country where I'm from, I'm not aware of that this type of tax exists. It's a bit strange to my knowledge. Okay, we can have a look at it.
Indeed, it seems that those kind of actions are very they're very local. So it's very local based. So those are the elements that need to be then looked into on a case by case. This was again more broader study so far. I would like just to react on one element that Josien van Harten is asking, who has been consulted in the food chain, whether the food industry was involved, and what is the incentive potential. I don't know if Silvana, you want to answer this question, or otherwise we can also wait for the presentation of Matteo.
Yes, we did interview value chain actors from the food sector, including retailers, but also food production companies and processors. And so a lot of the incentives that we've seen provided by them were related to offtake agreements, but also more related on the technical support side. And what we've noticed is also the limited scale of these programs, often at a pilot level. And also because one of the challenges that they shared with us was the fact that they can be costly programs to implement, which limits the scalability of such programs.
Thank you, Silvana. I will just take one more question, and then we can move to the presentation of Matteo. So Johan Frey is asking, are you looking at scalability of identified incentives for region ag? Yes, SoilValues is, and this is coming later on in the project. So those are upcoming results that will be published in the coming month to years. So I hope this is helping, and I would just invite you to stay in touch with SoilValues via the various platforms, whether it's X, LinkedIn, or simply the website to stay in touch with the upcoming development. I would like now just to give the floor to Matteo so that we can move on and then deep dive again into the Q&A session. So Matteo, I give you the floor.
Excellent, thank you. We will also touch on scalability in a second, but okay, so let's build on what Silvana just showed us, which is kind of a key findings of our research. So effective incentives need to embed financing, de-risking, and technical support. That's the bottom line. That's the content of the incentives. But we didn't stop there. We kind of started thinking, okay, but then how can we design effective incentives, and what kind of we need to do and think of when developing those instruments? And we came down to kind of three main points that I will elaborate on, leading to how we get this into practice. So first, incentives need to be farmer-centric. Farmers, especially when it comes to agricultural land and the sector, they are the soil regenerators. There is no way about it. Being farmer-centric, however, does not only mean to develop instruments that address the needs of the farmers, but it also means to think how your incentive will interact with the farmers. User-friendly interfaces, easy to access. One of the things we saw over and over, time and time again, is some incentives are good, but just too complex or difficult to access. So farmer-centric, both in what you kind of want to address, but also how you think of farmers to interact with them. Secondly, effective incentives need to be place-based. There's a broad concept in place-based investments, and the scope of this it's kind of broad, but ultimately means that whatever instruments and solution you are developing, you are going to tailor that and adapt that to the local context. And the local context is broad, it's different, it's the landscape. It means the ecological conditions. It means the social and economic conditions, the institutional settings. Everything needs to be taken in consideration when thinking of addressing something specific in that context. And last but definitely not less important, is about what you're going to target with incentives. And we believe that effective incentives should have mixed targets. They need to be both practice and outcome based, so that we can distribute the risks and the rewards of soil health regeneration. And on this last point, I'm going to elaborate further in the next slide, please. Thank you. So why do we need to mix practice and outcome-based incentives? First and foremost is to address the shortcoming of the instruments that we have seen and assessed so far. Silvana showed you the wide range of incentives that we look at. Something that they were kind of falling short in those elements of effectiveness, it was due to the targets they were addressing. When you take, for example, fully practice-based incentives, it's definitely good in some way because it provides the upfront capital to the farmers that can have the money to develop something that they're fully in control with, its actions that could also be easily verified. And you know that if you're going to do something, you're going to access that support easy. However, what we saw that could kind of fall short in terms of effectiveness is the ultimate results and outcomes on soil health. So it might happen that you give some support to do something that then doesn't result in improvement in the soil quality. However, when you look at fully outcome-based incentives, It might be good for the supplier of incentives that tie the support and payment, for example, in the case of financing support, to the achievement of these results. So you will only get the support if the results are achieved. But that puts enormous pressures and risk on the farmers, because the pre-financing of those actions, it's all on the farmers. The farmers might not be full in control of those outcomes. And so there might be a situation in which you are kind of betting on the results of your action today, and the results tomorrow on soil health might not be generated. So you will understand that it's enormously risky move for the farmers. And that's why we believe that by mixing the targets and by providing, yes, a bit of upfront capital based on what you're going to do, on the promise of your actions, but then also the rewards down the road to reward the outcomes that you have generated, that's to us is the most effective way to go about. The other 2 points I mentioned before, thanks for the slide, the farmer-centric and place-based ultimately are part of the same kind of mantra that we need to think about, and which is that farmers exist in a landscape. You cannot be farmer-centric without being place-based. The two things kind of coexist together. What the farmer needs do and the challenges they face ultimately depends on where they are and the context in which they operate in. So when we think about designing incentives, we need to think of designing instruments that are adaptable, that could be tailored to the context in which we operate. Let's take a concrete example. For example, financing. You might understand that perhaps a working capital loans is what you need to support the farmers. However, the tenure, the repayment schedule, the interest rate, and the size of these loans, all the specifics will need to depend on what kind of crops, what's the size, where is this. Same for technical support. How can you help farmers improving the soil quality without targeting specifically the soil type of that region, the issue that farm is facing, and so on and so forth. So we need to design instruments that then could be adapted to the local condition. And a question you might have here, an absolutely legitimate question that we ask ourselves, and Johan before was mentioning that, is, okay, but how that can be scalable? Come on. If we go on the next slide. Thank you. So how do we make these incentives scalable? Ultimately, for us, it's all about aggregation. On the one side, typical to most investments, and probably more intuitive, is aggregating at the portfolio level. So whatever instruments you have, just bring together as many farmers as possible so that your incentives will reach sufficient scale to be viable and in some way a possible solution. And that's absolutely fine, but we should not stop there. When it comes to soil health and regenerative agriculture, the risks and the outcomes are multiple and diverse. They speak, as we said before, to many different stakeholders. So another element, a layer of aggregation, should be of the organization and stakeholders supporting the farm, around the farmers. We should also aggregate them and bring together those actors so that we can distribute the risk, take some of the risk off the farmers and place them into other stakeholders, the one that Silvana mentioned in our mapping. Those actors can take some of the risk, but by taking some of the risk, that doesn't mean that that's it. We also need to reward this risk-taking activity, and so also distribute the outcomes. Soil health is a very diverse and complex kind of impact dimension, has different elements: the carbon, the biodiversity, the water, the soil fertility, production. These outcomes are interest to different stakeholders, and we need to distribute that. But secondly, and very much linked to our key research finding that Silvana showed you before, is if we accept that incentives to be effective need to be providing a kind of comprehensive package and different supports, but we also acknowledge that no organizations alone can provide all of that, then we need to bring in different actors. An effective incentive is not one organization building the super duper program. It's about different organizations coming in to what they do best because of the interest they have, and then together they support that transition. So if aggregation is our kind of recipe for scale, and we said before about how we believe we should design incentive, the last point I want to make today is giving a concrete example of like what this strategy could look like. And that's when we want to kind of stress the importance of blended finance. If we go on the next slide, please. So incentives, when are they needed? It's early stage in the transition that is needed. We need to convince the farmers to embark on the journey, but also in the early stages, in the early phases, we need to give them the tools to really make it through the other side. As we say sometimes, the famous valley of death could become the valley of hope, and a process in which then you get to a level in which the improved profitability of your business model could be leveraged to access capital through commercial actors such as banks, but also you start seeing the benefit and the outcomes in the soil health, and the impact is being materialized. But until that moment is not there, when it's still about the experimentation and still fine-tuning your transition, that's what we need incentives. And that's when we need grants, ultimately. Capital that doesn't have returns expectations. And blended finance allows us to do that in a clever way. But also what blended finance allows us to do, besides mixing the kind of type of finances, so the grants and the commercial capital, it also allows us to mix different supports and different actors, as we said before, crucial, aggregating those stakeholders. So we can really create through blended finance the one interface for farmers, in which this different support is all channeled together through one interface for farmers. And bringing together stakeholders, mixing grants and concessional capital, but to do what? So while the kind of commercial capital use, it's more kind of easy to understand, and you know, agricultural banks, for example, have always developed financial products for farmers. What we could get clever about is how to use the grants to catalyze that commercial capital. And we want to make 3 concrete examples of like how a blended finance facility could look like, one of which links also to the impact bonds example we were mentioning before. So first, we could use concessional capital from philanthropic and public organizations to create a technical assistance facility attached to commercial investment. Technical assistance facility that would provide the know-how and the tools to farmers to develop the transition plan and start implementing that. But we could also use grants capital to take off and absorb some of that financial risk. It could be done, for example, through a compensation loss, or for example, a guarantee, or perhaps providing advance payments on future revenues. So instead of let farmers wait, you provide the capital today, and then you as a financial actor wait for the possible uncertain future revenue streams. And last, we could use grants to pay for the outcomes. Someone in the chat before was mentioning about payment for ecosystem services. It's much more than carbon. And there are philanthropic organizations which have capital that is impact driven, and they're looking to support and purchase those kind of achieved outcomes and measurable, tangible outcomes. And so we could use that within the context of blended finance. If we go to the next slide, as a kind of closing remarks of like why we believe blended finance could be helpful for the soil health regenerative transition. First and foremost, it just increases the amount of capital available to the transition. That's a key point here. We are trying to provide more support and better support to farmers in those early stages, which are the riskiest and the most difficult to go through. Secondly, blended finance is not about compiling a list of possible incentives and tell the farmer, here you are, these 100 instruments, go, knock 100 doors, send 100 applications, and you sort it. Blended finance is about channeling them together. It's the famous like one-stop shop solution. It could be through an incubator, it could be through a blended finance facility, and impact bonds at the same time. There are different instruments, but ultimately it's about providing different supports in one. And then thirdly, and probably kind of nuance, but is this idea of realigning incentives, realigning interests, distributing the risk. When we think about all the risks that the transition to soil health and regenerative farming has, they cannot be all on the farmers. And so through blended finance, we can distribute some of them. I mentioned before the example of what can be done with financial risk, for instance. But ultimately, it's also about realigning the interest. We mentioned before the multiple positive of soil health, different drivers for different stakeholders. They can all be brought together through a blended finance facility, which is also, and this is kind of my final point, a key solution for the transition. Because while we need to wait a long time before soil health kind of happens and materialize, not all the actors, for example, investor, commercial actors within the agri-food value chain, had the same time horizon. And so we need financial innovations and solutions such as blended finance to really realign those and make sure that different actors with different expectations and time horizon can still work together and support the farmers in the transition.
Thank you very much, Matteo. It was a very rich presentation, but a very relevant one. And I also want already to thank those participants who are sending us questions in the various chat boxes. I would like just to give my current takeaways from those presentations. The first one is that obviously the sense of urgency to address within the entire food system the importance of soil health is already acknowledged, and but it largely comes down to the land manager and to the farming community to implement those soil health management practices. However, they entirely or quite often depend on the rest of the food chain. So there is a real need for collaboration and a fair collaboration. I see there are also three components for its success. There's this financial support, both upfront and outcome-based. This is what Matteo highlighted as well. There's this element of de-risking the mechanisms. So by all means, we are speaking here about real businesses with low room for maneuver in order to keep profitable. So this is a nice hint for the rest of the food value chain actors listening today. If you want the farming community to pick up on incentives, don't expect them to bear the costs and the risk on their own. And then there's a third element here that I noticed is the technical support. So I'm almost tempted to speak here, not just the technical advice, but here we're also speaking about knowledge empowerment to the right stakeholder groups. This is now the moment where I would like to pause and come back to the questions that have been asked by you all participants. Don't shy away of challenging the panelists, and there are some really good questions already. I'd like to start one question from Thibaut Perez. This is a question for Matteo. Matteo, Thibaut is asking, could you explain how an impact bond could help cover the additional costs for farmers in Europe when implementing agroecological practices? So purchasing cover crop seeds, organic matter, specialized equipment. Could you respond to this?
Yes, 100%. So I think that one of these missing piece, one of the missing piece of impact bonds that I don't see in the question is like for what outcomes. So ultimately, impact bonds are all about the outcomes. The outcomes are what you kind of secure funding for. And then because of that, then you attract the capital at the beginning to fund that intervention. So I don't want to now kind of remind me again what kind of practices were mentioned, but maybe cover crops and composting, whatever. Like the point here would be what kind of outcomes do we want to achieve with those practices? And then the impact bond, which is a blended finance structures and product, would work in the sense that some investors, commercial ones that are seeking some returns, would provide you the capital upfront to do those things, composting, cover cropping, as you were mentioning. You do that for a period. In that period, you monitor and measure the results. At the end of this intervention, based on how much outcomes have you generated, and this is all contractually written and agreed on prior to start that intervention. Based on that outcome being generated, funding from philanthropic, public organizations would kind of pay you for the impact units that you have generated. And then if you have been good, that amount that you get from outcome funding will be enough to repay the investors, even with a little bit of return, and then keep some money for yourself as well. So the system of impact bonds it works like that. There is someone, like a farmer in the case, that it's implementing those practices. There is a social investor that funds those practices early, and then someone at the end of the road that is willing to pay for the outcome being generated. One very kind of minor, like to be precise, there are different type of impact bonds, mainly depending on who is paying ultimately the outcomes. So if it's because a philanthropic organization has a theory of change and impact thesis that fits that, we usually refer to that as maybe development impact bonds. But there is the first case was actually a social impact bonds, in which you actually have the public paying for those outcomes because you are proving that your outcome will generate a cost savings to the public. Classic example is health, or classic example is welfare cost. So if you're doing something that will reduce the welfare cost for the public in the future, that's how you price that outcome. And those usually are referred to as social impact bonds. But yeah, more to be found on that if you're interested, and also happy to pick up the conversation.
Thank you, Matteo. And actually, I mean, this is a little bit also reminding me of those testing grounds we have within the project in the Netherlands, for example, where, you know, it's those community-supported agriculture kind of farms that we are building up. So I think this is also going to perhaps answer some of the questions of Suzanne Padel. There is this social aspect where also you get the direct reward. Let's say the farmer gets the direct reward from his consumers and buyers. So it's also a matter of value chain length, I would refer to. There has been a question in that regard as well from Suzanne Padel about what this is perhaps for Silvana. What role did organizations of organic farming play in your interviews? Would you be able to respond to this, Silvana?
Yes, so we spoke to different type of project intermediaries, and by that we meant both carbon intermediaries, so offering farmers facilitated access to the carbon credit market, but also associations and advisory support organizations and communities to farmers. And in terms of, I think we didn't interview specifically organization focused on organic farming only, but there are definitely overlapping interest between organic farming and regenerative agriculture. And that is why we also included these type of organizations in our outreach. And the key takeaways from these interviews was more related to the type of peer-to-peer support that farmers can provide to other farmers. And we, as Carolina also mentioned before, in terms of advisory and technical support, we included in that category all the incentives that are not coming only from more specialized and agronomy, from the scientific agronomic type of support, but also that fostering communities of farmers and identifying, for example, role models that can act as a catalyzing force within landscapes of farmers. And these communities are a key component of and a key drivers of these type of incentives.
Thank you very much.
If I may, sorry,
Sure.
Caroline, just
Yes, okay.
kind of a contribution linked also in terms of like what these actors are interested in. Something that, for example, we found in the actors in the interview Silvana was referring to, for example, within the investment community, sometimes organic farming is one of kind of market differentiators that are easy to relate to. For example, if you have money and you need to demonstrate the impact and what you're investing, having an organic certified farmers, it's easier than a farmer that is doing something regenerative, but it's more difficult to justify. So I think in our discussion paper, you will also find a moment in which we kind of try to go through the agroecology, organic and regenerative agriculture. And to be fair, that's not our job to say this is one is better than the other or whatnot. For us, it was more about they're very similar. There are many overlaps, but we decided to go in that direction because of the reasons I was mentioning early on, the flexibility, the inclusivity, the focus on outcomes. But those overlaps exist, and we just need to accept it. I think that organic, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, they are kind of part of the same conversation, and they're not mutually exclusive.
Thank you, Matteo. I'm taking away a couple of important elements here. I mean, Silvana, you mentioned advice and technical support. I mean, this is a key. These are key components for anyone who's trying to transition in a business. And I'm really taking it here from a business point of view. There is obviously the whole financial aspect of this transition that is crucial. Obviously, I mean, there's a question here between the length and the moment when the financial support comes in during this transition. This was also one of the questions that Bo Christensen has been asking. Did you manage to quantify the risk and the need for finance which the farmer is facing during the first years of his transition? I mean, obviously, this is important to keep an eye on, because even if the financing comes at the beginning, it's often showing that it's not enough. And this is also one of the first outcomes and the first results from several of the testing grounds that SoilValues is working with. I would like to pick up another question from Lorraine Lebelt. How or who do farmers get the business model advice from? Because, and yes, you're right, it is different from one country to another. At least within SoilValues, we have tried to connect every time for each testing ground country a research, so an economic research institute or university with a farm, so that the advice, the economic advice comes for its business model comes from this institute or this university or research center. And the second part of your question, Lorraine, is, and this is, I think, again for Matteo, what do you think is the best way to make blended finance support accessible for farmers? Very important point. Matteo, can you react to this?
Yes, I can, but I would like to link it to one other question I saw in the chat from Luis. And I think the point of us suggesting blended finance is that how can we make it accessible and good for the farmers, but also for the other actors? And I think that's key here. Realigning the incentives, distributing the risk, realigning the interest. It's not only for the farmers. That's why we're saying if we want to take off the risk from the farmer and place it in someone else, those other organizations need also to get the rewards for that. Someone else in the chat was mentioning how does that relate to scope 3 emission reduction of corporate within the agri-food value chain? It does very substantially. So if that's the driver to support, we need to kind of get those organizations on board with how and what they can provide the farmer with, but then give that as an exchange. So ultimately, how can we make blended finance attractive and accessible is about understanding what's the exchange here and creating this platform to provide something in return of something else. So when we think, for example, about the farmers, we also, beyond the context of SoilValue, we work on regenerative agriculture. We talk with different actors within the agri-food value chain, and we discuss products. And for example, something I'm very passionate about that comes from the startup culture is if we accept that farmers are like companies that are developing their business model, and just farmers that we have today are just in developing the soil health business models. So the idea of taking those models, such as, for example, incubators or accelerators, that are programs effectively of technical support, but we attach that with a kind of financial structure that also provide the financing. So here you are that you start seeing a specific product that is accessible to farmers. You see that in the UK, in Cotswold, they started this, for example, regenerative agriculture accelerator, and has huge demand. In Belgium, where we're based, both Sivan and myself, there are companies that provide that support, and farmers are seeking that. EIT Food organization within the European Union has a regenerative agriculture program in the south of Europe, massive interest. So the point is to build on existing block. We are not claiming to invent anything new. What we are offering with blended finance is to just leverage what's existing, bringing it together through, and you know, that's kind of our kind of also job in blended finance, about structuring those products and bringing those type of supports together and providing the farmers what they need to, as well as the other stakeholders. And that's, to me, is key. So I just don't think maybe we have now the time to kind of talk specific projects in detail, because as we said, we need to then adapt that. But you see that there are across Europe similar type of programs and supports. And what we're saying is, let's bring something together. Let's kind of play with these components, and let's kind of improve the effectiveness of this instrument through blended finance structures.
Thank you, Matteo. There are several questions coming in, obviously also related to the policy framework. I mean, we all know that farming is not just a simple business as such, but it is also very strongly linked, if I will not say constrained, through its policy framework. And one of the main policy environment we obviously know for agriculture and for the agricultural sector is the Common Agriculture Policy. And Kilian has asked a question: so which role does or will the Common Agriculture Policy in the EU play for Region Ag when considering blended private finance? And so he's giving examples: voluntary eco-scheme service markets with public funding, for example, through the national CAP implementation. So what should be here the best model to combine them? I'm tempted to ask Mark to answer this question. Mark, how do you see here the link between, you know, the research results so far we've found with the discussion paper, and then how do we link this with the Common Agriculture Policy?
It's of course obvious that we have to link this. First of all, I think we have to formulate on the basis of the findings of Matteo and his team and the right policy recommendations. We are not yet in this policy recommendations formulation, but I think this is something we have to do as soon as possible. It's also provided for, I think, in the project. And then we have to try to, it's very clear that it should be complementary to what's provided by public funding, because you can never have a double payment. It should be avoided. So we need to define a number of rules so that we can verify that it's complementary to the public funds that are already available. And in that way, we can optimize the general envelope that is at the disposal of the farmer to finance the different incentives. But like I said, step by step, we have the research results now. We will develop the policy recommendations, and this should be developed in relation to what's existing today and what might be on the table in the coming weeks and months when developing the new Common Agricultural Policy for the period after 2027.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, we could dig in a bit further here on the question of policy framework. There have been several questions related to certification schemes. If, for example, and we hear a lot, and there's quite a focus also on carbon farming in this survey, in the research, but also within the project of SoilValues as such. Is there anything we can learn from the current certification framework on carbon farming in Europe that could be beneficial? For example, for the soil health, could we, for example, think about a soil health certificate? Is this something we could consider, Mark? Do you have a view, an opinion on this?
Yeah, the basis for this, first of all, if you want to have something certified, you need to have a measured impact that is credible. And on the other hand, that's also affordable, because you can have a very credible measure. It costs a huge amount of money. And that's still the discussion we are in there. We should come to measurable impact that is gives sufficient reliability, both for the suppliers as the funders of impact, that in fact what is they are financing and what they are offering is really there. And yeah, a lot of effort is also financed by the European Commission to develop these key performance indicators, to develop these measurements in a way that they can be really affordable. And we are still there in the process. And as long as this is not really solved, it is of course a barrier to launch all these to get this REG-AG and these ecosystem services in place. So the main point is there: develop reliable measurement systems that are also affordable to all the players in the game.
Thank you very much. I will come back to the question, because there are several questions still coming in on the financial aspect, obviously financing. And this is coming from Tim Rhodes, I think for Matteo most likely. Do we know how much, if any, money has been invested from private finance into farms practicing regenerative agriculture and providing public benefits? This is a really good question. Thank you for it. Matteo, would you like to respond?
Yes. Yes, and perhaps I would kind of divide this into two different kind of models, so that also gives me the opportunity to share one other kind of increasingly attractive investment opportunity that has to do with soil health, regenerative agriculture, but less to really supporting the farmers' transition. And for example, an increasing attractive instruments that private investors are using to generate both impact and financial returns is actually using the model that is very much kind of a real estate and leveraging the value of the land. There is actually a sustainable land manager, which is an asset manager, that has been doing that for ages. They also have some reports showing a bit like where they stand in terms of like returns of these investments. And the model here is very simple. You buy land, you give it to a farmer that is already regenerative, that knows how to transition. And by doing that, by buying the land and giving to a land manager that is going to perform that regeneration, the value of the land increases, your portfolio improves, and that's your investment. Great model. Private capital is very much attracted to that because of the because of the model, which is a kind of classic impact investing model. However, that does not address our goal. And our goal, when we started the research and kind of how Silvana show you, we were looking at a farmer that is already there, that is growing stuff, has been growing that in the same way for 50 years, maybe small farmers. How do we get that person into the transition? Buying off the land and placing someone else, that's not really the solution we were looking at. So private capital is being deployed through that model. Some other companies, for example, within the agri-food value chain, are also looking at vertical integration of soil health and regenerative agriculture. That's exactly also based on that. Instead of maybe purchasing from regenerative farmers, why don't you just start growing stuff on your own through that way? So that's one point I wanted to make in terms of like how capital has been flowing. On the other hand, you have also across the spectrum, especially at the corporate level, a lot of programs are happening now. Silvana mentioned pilot stage, early stage, self-funded, mainly grants at this stage. But what we're talking about, this is effectively private capital going into investments of regeneration because of different interests. And to be fair, I don't know if there is anyone in the webinar from this specific interest in industry, but I'm going to give an example to show a bit like, to give a concrete example of what Silvana was referring to as mitigating the risk within the supply chain. So you have, for example, great productions that are very much based on specific geographies. Take champagne as an example. Climate change is here. We have seen things, or Prosecco. I'm Italian, so maybe let's go with Prosecco. You have like products that are grown in a specific region. If it's true that climate change is going to push everything a bit northern, we might not have any Prosecco. So here you have private companies that are actually investing heavily on transitioning those areas from a kind of climate adaptation, climate resilience perspective. It's either do it or not doing it, but maybe being out of business in 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. So again, another example of private capital flowing in terms of supply chain risking. Sorry. And so that's something else we've seen, and something else again that we could bring into the picture of potentially blended finance structure, especially on Prosecco. Now I mentioned there is a case, for example, if you want to look at a concrete case of how blended finance could look like, how bringing different stakeholders and aggregation could bring a scale for a solution, or maybe post it in the chat. It's called LENS, the Landscape Enterprise Network. Yeah, I think so. It's called LENS, starting in UK, also operating in Italy, indeed, with the Prosecco region. And that's really about bringing in different stakeholders for different reasons and different outcomes, and really flowing private capital into the regeneration. So I'm not sure if that answered the question. In terms of volume, is difficult because it depends on what we're going to put in the picture. But definitely, and that's my point here, definitely private capital is going there because A, there is an attractive investment proposition, B, it's good for business, C, sometimes it's the only option.
Thank you, Matteo. I mean, I have been visiting myself a couple of regenerative farms this year, and in fact, very often it comes really down to the motivation of the farmers, but obviously also to his capacity to leverage funds. And it often, of course, works, but it requires really a lot of passion and devotion to get such a business model running. And like I said, like there's this aspect on de-risking of finance is really particularly important. You know, not just because you have a couple of hectares of vineyards in a specific region doesn't mean you are able to change it from one day to another. This takes time, and there the policy framework, again, to come back to it, can be constraining because sometimes the incentives or the willingness of changing and adapting the business model to mitigate climate change, for example, is faster, but is not, and the policy framework is not fast enough in adapting as well and accommodating the wanted change. To this specific element, I see here again a question on the financial incentives and the question of I'm looking at it here, excuse me, several questions are coming in. Yes, it was on the benchmarking, indeed, and Marc Rosier has already answered the question. SoilValues is in contact with a number of European projects that are also Horizon Europe projects that are called Benchmark. And there's this one called MRE for SOC. I really invite you to take a look at them, because this is also looking at input from them to look at reliable and affordable indicators of soil health. And this is also what SoilValues is studying. I am constrained to slowly come to an end because it's already 11:45. I would ask each panelist to perhaps give one last comment before wrapping up myself the session and then closing the webinar. I would like to ask with Silvana. Silvana, would you like to bring in here a last remark or comment?
Yes, thank you. So I think one final thing I'd like to say is what can be useful about the discussion paper and, for example, the categorization that we made of incentive instruments. What we tried to do was to provide a menu of instruments that are currently being offered in the market and that can be useful for all the stakeholders in the value chain to choose from and get inspired from to support farmers in the transition. And this offering is evolving as the market is growing. And even in the current list, there are some incentives that are well established and still well developed and not at a pilot stage. But there are others that are still in the very early stages and could be very effective if scaled to include even more stakeholders and farmers. And that is why our call to action and our hope to use the blended finance solution is to really bring these solutions together and scale them to have a far wider reach to different landscapes in Europe.
Thank you, Silvana. Perhaps I give the floor first to Matteo, but then very shortly, and then to Mark.
Yeah, no, I very much wanna build on what Silvana mentioned, and indeed for us the point now is and I think we have a sense of what are the options we could deploy and implement. It's about finding those aggregators. As Silvana was mentioning, I think that the ingredients are there. I think we now understand the recipe. We work already on possible products. Is really to find those aggregators, to bring those farmers together. Could be corporate actors, and within their supply chain, it could be at the local level, so also maybe local authorities or anyway, kind of geographically wise. It could be like indeed I mentioned the case of Lens and the Landscape Enterprise Network, different kind of actors and kind of outcomes. So ultimately, what we need is to have those aggregators coming together, bring in different farmers in our context of regenerative agriculture, and then try to understand what's the best design for the solution. But we've been doing this for quite some time. I think we are getting validation from the market. There is appetite for philanthropic organizations, from private investors, from institutional investors as well, project intermediaries. We have in the webinar a couple of those agronomists helping the transition, technical support. So it's really about coming together to make something that is scalable, viable, and therefore attractive.
I couldn't agree more with you, Matteo. The only element here I would add is like just make sure that, again, the private sector often advances faster than the public. So this is where I think we, especially as a European funded project, should make sure that this is somehow speeding up at some point. Mark, your last word.
The last word, what an honor. So I would like to refer to a very important statement made by Silvana. No individual instrument or stakeholder can effectively single-handed incentivize the transition. So we need to work together, public and private, farmers, processors, agro supply, retailers, the whole food chain. We have to work together to get the work done. And we have to put all the different instruments in place. So they have to be complementary. There should be no competition. There should be complementary. And it's the only way to get this whole transition done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will try to wrap up. Indeed, but again, 3 points. No individual instrument or stakeholder can effectively single-handedly incentivize the transition. This is what Mark just tried to highlight, I think. And let's not forget that soil is only one component for a farm and a farm business. It is not the only one. A farm business is a lot more complex than that. Second point I would like just to make here is that farmers need a comprehensive support package that encompasses financing, de-risking, and technical support. I think we cannot emphasize that enough. And 3, align the interests and the time horizon of investors with soil regeneration. Farming is a complicated business. Soil regeneration takes time, and farmers are weather dependent. So most importantly, they want to be the decision makers for their own business. And therefore, fair cooperation here is also a key element of success. Before you leave, we kindly ask you to fill out the satisfaction survey that will appear on your screen when unlogging. The recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube and on our website in a few days from now. We thank you all, and I would like also to thank the panelists today and Sergio, my colleague, who supported us to deliver this webinar, and also on behalf of the entire SoilValues Consortium to take part in today's event. Don't forget to check out the discussion paper published by COIS as part of this project, and keep in touch with us through the newsletter and social media. À bientôt, and see you soon again.